Preamble. I undoubtedly owe you, at the beginning of this preamble, a first explication concerning the word impression, which risks, in my title, being somewhat enigmatic. I became aware of this afterward, when Elizabeth Raudinesco asked me on the telephone for a provisional title, so as indeed to send the program of this conference to press, almost a year before inscribing and printing on my computer the first word of what I am saying to you here. The response I then improvised ended up in effect imposing the word impression. And in an instant, it was as if three meanings had condensed themselves and overprinted each other from the back of my memory. Which were they? Without waiting, I have spoken to you of my computer, of the little portable Macintosh on which I have begun to write. For it has not only been the first substrate to support all of these words. On a beautiful morning in California a few weeks ago, I asked myself a certain question, among so many others. Without being I-25 able to find a response, while reading on the one hand Freud, on the other Yerushalmi, and while tinkling away on my computer. I asked myself what is the moment proper to the archive, if there is such a thing, the instant of archivization strictly speaking, which is not, and I will come back to this, so-called live or spontaneous memory, mneme or anamnesis, but rather a certain hypomnesic and prosthetic experience of the technical substrate. Was it not at this very instant that, having written something or other on the SCEN, the letters remaining as if suspended and floating yet at the surface of a liquid element, I pushed a certain key to save a text undamaged, in a hard and lasting way, to protect marks from being erased, so as to ensure in this way salvation and indemnity, to stock, to accumulate, and, in what is at once the same thing and something else, to make the sentence available in this way for printing? And for reprinting, for reproduction? Does it change anything that Freud did not know about the computer? And where should the moment of suppression or of repression be situated in these new models of recording and impression, or printing? This condensation of three meanings of the word impression was only able to imprint itself in me in a single stroke, apparently in an instant of no duration, after much work, discontinuous though it may have been, with Freud's texts, with certain of his writings, but also with themes, with figures, with conceptual schemes that are familiar to me to the point of obsession and yet remain no less secret, young, and still to come for me, writing, the trace, inscription, on an exterior substrate or on the so-called body proper, as for example, and this is not just any example for me, that singular and immemorial archive called circumcision, and which, though never leaving you, nonetheless has come about, and is no less exterior right on your body proper. So what are these three meanings which, in a single instant, condensed themselves and overprinted each other, that is to say overdetermined each other, in the word impression and the phrase Freudian impression? And above all, of course, in their relationship to that reproducible, iterable, and conservative production of memory, to that objectivizable storage called the archive? 26I1. The first impression is scriptural or typographic, that of an inscription, Niederschrift, says Freud throughout his works, which leaves a mark at the surface or in the thickness of a substrate. And in any case, directly or indirectly, this concept or rather this figure of the substrate marks the properly fundamental assignation of our problem, the problem of the fundamental. Can one imagine an archive without foundation, without substrate, without substance, without subjectal? And if it were impossible, what of the history of substrates? What of the future of the substrate in its relationship to the history of psychoanalysis? From the sketches of To Beyond, to the mystic pad and beyond, there is no limit to this problematic of the impression, that is, of the inscription, which leaves a mark right on the substrate. This then becomes a place of consignation, of inscription or of recording, as the metapsychology frequently says, Niederlassung oder Niederschrift, installation, location or registration, when it recalls, for example in the unconscious, at least three things, a. the topological hypothesis of several psychological systems, 2 or 3, thus what permits one to justify the distinction between memory and archive explains why psychoanalysis was spoken of, and in part, incorrectly, as a depth psychology or an abyssal psychology, Typhon psychology, SE 14, 173, b. This topic has nothing to do, for the moment, at this time, for the present, underlined by Freud, with an anatomical point of view on cerebral localizations. By stressing in italics for the present, for Leipzig, Freud clearly wants to leave room for what the future of science may teach us about this. See lastly, these hypotheses are nothing other, and nothing more than, intuitive representations, Veranschaulichungen, graphic illustrations according to the English translation. They set out to be no more than graphic illustrations. SE 14, 175. This problematic of impression is discouraging for those who might wish to find in it a privileged entrance. Because it becomes confused with the whole corpus of Freud's works, whether it has to do with collective or individual memory, with censorship or repression, with dynamic, with topic, or with economy, with the UCS or PCS systems, with perception, with mnesic trace. It is undoubtedly because I had already privileged it, in many 127 other texts, that this typographic figure of the press, of printing, or of the imprint imposed itself so quickly on me over the telephone with the word impression. This word capitalizes on a double advantage, above all in a country of English-speaking culture. In the first place, it reawakens the code of English empiricism, the concepts of sensible impression and of copy play a major role there in the genealogy of ideas, and is not the copy of an impression already a sort of archive? In the second place, the word impression reminds us that no tunnel in history will ever align the two translations of Verdrängung, repression in English, as in Spanish, a word that belongs to the same family as impression, the Verdrängung always represses an impression, and refoulement in French, a word that is not allied to the semantic family of the impression, as is the word repression, which we reserve in French for the translation of Unterdrücken, most often translated in English, as in Spanish and Portuguese, by suppression. The stakes of this conceptual difference between Verdrängung and Unterdrücken are not limited to nominal questions of translation, of rhetoric, or of semantics, although they are also accumulated there. They directly concern the structures of archivization. Because they touch on the topic differences and thus on the location of the substrates of traces, on the subjectal of consignation, Niederschrift, from one system to the other. Unlike repression, Verdrängung, which remains unconscious in its operation and in its result, suppression, Unterdrücken, affects what Freud calls a second censorship between the conscious and the preconscious, or rather affects the affect, which is to say, that which can never be repressed in the unconscious but only suppressed and displaced in another affect. It is one of the numerous questions we will not be able to treat here. In their epistemology, in their historiography, in their operations as well as in their object, what should the classical archivists or historians make of this distinction between repression and repression, between Verdrängung and Unterdrücken, between repression and suppression? If this distinction has any relevance, it will be enough to disrupt the tranquil landscape of all historical knowledge, of all historiography, and even of all self-consistent scholarship. Who could say that this has only begun to happen? And even among the historians of psychoanalysis, who nevertheless ought to be the first to rework their axiomatics and their methodology, even assuming that the classical concept of historical science and of scholarship still resists and rides out this mutation intact? To this orients us toward the second valence of the word impression. It no doubt seems less immediately necessary and obvious. Impression, Freudian impression, this no doubt made something else be felt in anticipation. What? Well, concerning the archive, Freud never managed to form anything that deserves to be called a concept. Neither have we, by the way. We have no concept, only an impression, a series of impressions associated with a word. To the rigor of the concept, I am opposing here the vagueness or the open imprecision, the relative intermination of such a notion. Archive is only a notion, an impression associated with a word and for which, together with Freud, we do not have a concept. We only have an impression, an insistent impression through the unstable feeling of a shifting figure, of a schema, or of an infinite or indefinite process. Unlike what a classical philosopher or scholar would be tempted to do, I do not consider this impression, or the notion of this impression, to be a subconcept, the feebleness of a blurred and subjective pre-knowledge, destined for I know not what sin of nominalism, but to the contrary, as I will explain later, I consider it to be the possibility and the very future of the concept, to be the very concept of the future, if there is such a thing and if, as I believe, the idea of it. Archive depends on it. This is one of the theses. There are essential reasons for which a concept in the process of being formed always remains inadequate relative to what it ought to be, divided, disjointed between two forces. And this disjointedness has a necessary relationship with the structure of archivization. It follows, certainly, that Freudian psychoanalysis proposes a new theory of the archive. It takes into account a topic and a death drive without which there would not in effect be any desire or any possibility for the archive. But at the same time, at once for strategic reasons and because the conditions of archivization implicate all the I-29 tensions, contradictions, or aporias we are trying to formalize here, notably those which make it into a movement of the promise and of the future no less than of recording the past, the concept of the archive must inevitably carry in itself, as does every concept, an unknowable weight. The presupposition of this weight also takes on the figures of repression and suppression, even if it cannot necessarily be reduced to these. This double presupposition leaves an imprint. It inscribes an impression in language and in discourse. The unknowable weight that imprints itself thus does not weigh only as a negative charge. It involves the history of the concept, it inflects archive desire or fever, their opening on the future, their dependency with respect to what will come, in short, all that ties knowledge and memory to the promise. 3. Freudian impression also has a third meaning, unless it is the first, the impression left by Sigmund Freud, beginning with the impression left in him, inscribed in him, from his birth and his covenant, from his circumcision, through all the manifest or secret history of psychoanalysis, of the institution and of the works, by way of the public and private correspondence, including this letter from Jacob Schlemmerfried to Schlemme Sigmund Freud in memory of the signs or tokens of the covenant and to accompany the new skin of a Bible. I wish to speak of the impression left by Freud, by the event which carries this family name, the nearly unforgettable and incontestable, undeniable impression, even and above all for those who deny it, that Sigmund Freud will have made on anyone, after him, who speaks of him or speaks to him, and who must then, accepting it or not, knowing it or not, be thus marked, in his or her culture and discipline, whatever it may be, in particular philosophy, medicine, psychiatry, and more. Precisely here, because we are speaking of memory and of archive, the history of texts and of discourses, political history, legal history, the history of ideas or of culture, the history of religion and religion itself, the history of institutions and of sciences, in particular the history of this institutional and scientific project called psychoanalysis. Not to mention the history of historiography. In any given discipline, one should no longer be able to, thus one no longer has the right or the means to claim to speak of this without having been marked in advance, in one way or another, by this Freudian impression. It is impossible and illegitimate to do so without having integrated, well or badly, in an important way or not, recognizing it or denying it, what is here called the Freudian impression. If one is under the impression that it is possible not to take this into account, forgetting it, effacing it, crossing it out, or objecting to it, one has already confirmed, we could even say countersigned, thus archived, a repression or a suppression. This, then, is perhaps what I heard without hearing, what I understood without understanding, what I wanted obscurely to overhear, allowing these words to dictate to me over the telephone, in Freudian impression.